When Cross Country Checkup needs the foremost expert in bullying, cyberbullying, education law, Rex Murphy comes to Wayne MacKay. When Peter Mansbridge from the National needs the foremost expert in these areas after the Amanda Todd tragedy, Professor Wayne MacKay from Dalhousie University. The timing could not have been more spectacular in terms of this issue being a foremost issue for us. Professor MacKay is the author of Respectful and Responsible Relationships. There's no app for that. This is the task force from the Nova Scotia Task Force on Bullying and Cyberbullying. Professor Wayne MacKay was the chair of that task force. He is the preeminent expert in education law in Canada. Professor MacKay wrote, I think, his first textbook in the early 1980s. He effectively invented education law. I have the utmost respect for everything he says and writes. We are very, very fortunate and lucky to have Professor MacKay here with us today. Professor Wayne MacKay.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the kind remarks. The actual title of the talk is Respectful and Responsible Relationships, Managing Bullying and Cyberbullying, although this is the title of the report, which was, I guess, part of my attempt to be clever, is there's no app for that. And of course, partly trying to speak the language of younger people, but I think more importantly, that in itself is an important message. There's no simple solution. There's no silver bullet to this problem. And it really, as the report states, it's really a symptom of larger issues in Canadian society in terms of lack of respect, lack of responsibility, the breakdown of community, the inhumanity of people, not just children, to others. So it's a much bigger issue and one that pretty well consumed me for the more or less year of the task force and continues to consume me in interesting ways. So this is what I'm going to talk about. All right, first point, just a couple of things. I'm not going to develop this in great length, but I do think there's important links between issues of bullying and inclusion in schools, and particularly given the broad definition of inclusion as being an approach. And so much of bullying and cyberbullying, as we'll see as we go through this, and as many of you know, is really about alienation and being excluded, whether it's particular groups or others. So I think there are some really quite important links. And earlier in 2005, I did a study from New Brunswick on inclusive education, and one of the best definitions is this one we've adopted. And I might say right here, a lot of these slides I'm going to move through fairly quickly because there's a lot of them, but they are in your book. So you can get the details if you're having trouble sleeping at night or something. Okay, inclusion in its broadest sense, and I go on quoting really from my inclusion report, is not just about exceptionalities or people with disabilities or other people that need to be included, but it's really about creating a space where everyone can belong and feel included. And in that sense, and again, I'm sure most of you know these things already, but it's an important point that if we create a whole school and an inclusive school, that will go some distance to preventing some of the worst cases of bullying and cyberbullying. And perhaps a little more new territory, but truly inclusive schools are safer and less violent. And linking what probably are two of the biggest issues, I would suggest, in education law these days, how people manage the issues of violence in schools, but related to that, issues of bullying and cyberbullying and inclusion, all of those connected. But in many ways, I think one of the reasons that school-age children are so vulnerable and we have tragic suicides in the extreme cases and very serious effects is that if we think back, and many of you are much more in the trenches on this than I am, at that stage, whether it's junior high, senior high, elementary, belonging is everything. That if you're not in and you're excluded and you're on the outside, it's a tragic thing. And I think that's a sense, again, in which if we can really be inclusive and meet people's needs, then we're likely going to at least set the framework for a less bullying, less cyberbullying context. Best example, or one of the best examples, as Eric alluded to, the tragic situation of Amanda Todd from Vancouver, which has certainly focused a great deal of attention on the issue of cyberbullying, and in particular the extreme and tragic consequences of that. Let me just say at the outset, before I proceed to the next part, that's not to suggest that cyberbullying always leads to suicide. And in fact, as all of these complex issues play out, there was considerable concern in some quarters that all of the attention on the Amanda Todd situation would actually produce copycat suicides, and that's one danger, but also that all kinds of people who are bullied and cyberbullied do not necessarily commit suicide. Now, having said that, and a lot of this has been covered in the Globe and elsewhere, there are some pretty solid statistics that it's 4 to 6 times more likely that people who've been bullied or cyberbullied would at least think about or attempt suicide. So there is some link. And as some of the people who reported to us said, the impulse to commit suicide is much more likely when you face that. And Amanda Todd's situation is a terrible one. That connection, which if you need it, I'm not going to play it because it's a 9-minute heartbreaking video of her with the various cards telling her story of bullying and cyberbullying, which started as sexting in some senses, the flashing of her breasts and all the things that came after that. But I think it's worth looking at that, although it's very difficult. I'm not going to play that, but what I am going to do instead is to really, I think, dramatize the extent of the problem. What is the problem of bullying and cyberbullying and how big it is by playing a song that's been written about one of the several young women's suicides that were the foundation and trigger for the task force in Nova Scotia. And just before I put this one on, Jenna, who was about the same age as Amanda, 15, I believe, or 16, 15, I think, and had committed suicide, linked in at least significant measures to bullying and cyberbullying. And her mother, courageously and rather amazingly, she presents to a number of audiences about this, including videos, and she's allowed me to use these videos and song which was written about Jenna Bowers, who was the person who committed suicide. So if we can go to that.
Beautiful smile, beautiful face, beautiful eyes, could not erase those ruthless words that bruised her gentle soul. Words from the heartless took their toll. Precious life, their hatred stole. Such a tragic story. She was 15 years old. They say that words can't hurt you, but they're wrong. You could ask Jenna, but now she's gone. Don't let it be in vain. Silence speaks to no one, and the world just stays the same. Sing your songs in heaven, where there's love in every word. We won't forget you, little Jenna Bird. We can't go back and change the past, but we can change today. If you could go back, tell me, what words would you say? Jenna walked into the light and the angels called her name. God embraced her in his love Silence speaks to no one. Let your voice be heard. Speak words of kindness in memory of Jennifer.
On January 17th, 2011, sadly, Jenna Bowers Bryanton took her own life. She was a victim of relentless bullying. Silence speaks to no one. Let your voice be heard.
Beautiful smile, beautiful face, beautiful child, now in God's grace.
It gave everybody a moment to get out the Kleenex and so on, right? Very sad story, and it obviously makes the point, and unfortunately a very typical story. I mean, we have Amanda Todd on the West Coast. You have way too many of these, and as I'll point out, that's not the only consequence, but it's obviously one of the most extreme consequences of bullying and cyberbullying, and certainly speaks to how big the problem is, and that things need to be done. I can't remember, Eric very kindly came down and presented very well to our task force about the Ontario approaches and Ontario legislation. I can't remember if Pam Murchison, the mother, was. I don't think she was. Yeah, yeah. So she.
I saw her video.
Yes, that's right. Okay, exactly. So as I say, that in itself is an amazing story that we can talk about afterwards. Okay. So first of all, in order as a task force to try to get a grip on this, and frankly, not to belittle the response of the government, but I think the reality was that these high-profile suicides were really what triggered the task force, and they had us look at that. We proceeded by doing a couple of things in terms of trying to collect information. We had an online survey which produced 5,000 responses, which we were told was the most of any government survey they had ever done. And it was quite a lengthy, it took about 20 to 30 minutes to fill out the survey. So the fact that 5,000 people did it tells you how many people think this is a serious problem. And I'm sure Nova Scotia is typical of the rest of the country. And furthermore, even more astounding, off those 5,000 email responders, more than I think 60% were young people. So to imagine young people taking 20 to 30 minutes to fill out a form suggests that they in particular saw this as a serious problem. And towards the very last slide, which I'll get to in some form, has the site for where you can download the task force report, but you can also download the 10 or 12 appendices. One of them is the summary of this online survey of 5,000 people. The second one, we also were quite concerned to make sure that we had the youth perspective on the problems of bullying and cyberbullying and their insights. So we had youth focus groups in every school district in the province, more than one in every school district. We had about 36 youth focus groups, and in addition had some specific focus groups with targeted audiences like Aboriginals, African Nova Scotians, disabled, and so on. And very interesting and useful insights and information came out of that. And that report is also in the appendices, which you can download. And there's some really wonderful insights in that. One of the things that came out of the survey is to sort of follow up the fact that so many did this. 74% of those who were surveyed said that it was a major problem of bullying and cyberbullying. And an interesting kind of not in my backyard thing, 53% said it's a major problem in my own community. Certainly a problem somewhere else, maybe not at home, which may not be so true, but people often think that. But in both cases, a very high number of people saying that this is a very significant problem. The youth consultations and focus groups, as I said, produce some very interesting information in numbers. 39%, roughly, I guess 40% of students answered yes to being bullied online. And of those, 46% were high school, 38% junior, and 34% elementary. Now, these are just, of course, any stats can produce different things. I actually would have predicted junior high probably highest, although they are close. And one of the things that's certainly playing out as well, which is disturbing, is that it's also increasingly a significant issue at elementary as well. So that's there as well. Reasons for being bullied, the three major ones that came out of the youth focus groups. Number one, sexual orientation was the number one reason identified in the youth focus groups for being victims of bullying or cyberbullying. Number two, physical features or appearance. And number three, personal behavior. So that was what came out of that. One of the many insights, there's a great quotes that are both in the report and in the youth focus group appendix. One's like this: it really hurts when someone likes a hurtful comment about someone else, so don't do it. Don't let the bad message spread. And I think part of that is the power of technology. Bullying's always been there, but the added impact and power of bullying, so many levels. It's anonymous, it's there forever, but also it's so easy to gang up. And something as simply as hitting the like button, somebody puts a nasty comment and 80 people like it or 1,000 people like it. How does that make the victim of that comment feel? And part of the things we recommend in the report is educating people about that kind of impact and thinking before you decide to like a comment that really is bullying or cyberbullying somebody else. Reasons being bullied as identified by the online survey, a little bit different in that they didn't specifically address sexual orientation, but you can see the major one, the way you look, was 44%, and they weren't either or, obviously, because the numbers don't add up to 100, but they identified various things: who you hang out with, others think you're weird or different, and make good or bad grades. It didn't seem to matter too much whether you're at the top or the bottom, but that was a 24% factor in this 5,000 survey. But I think, this is just the students' part of it. The one thing that comes out of that, linking back to the inclusion point, though, is that a lot of it is being different, particularly looking different, acting different, hanging out with the wrong crowd, are the major factors that seem to identify you as a victim. So this, of course, plays into Aboriginals, blacks, non-Caucasians, disabled, gay, lesbian, and so on. A Canadian survey presented to the task force by Wendy Craig identified two reasons why young people wouldn't necessarily tell an adult that they were bullied or cyberbullied. And most people would have thought that the main reason, and it's the number two reason, is that it would get worse. But the number one reason, this was a Canada-wide survey, is quite interesting: fear that the parents would take away their technology. And if you pause there, I had all kinds of people during the task force say, well, what's the problem here? You just shut off the computer. There's no big deal. You don't give them a BlackBerry, and there's maybe some merit to that. But one of the things I discovered in the interesting process of the task force is if young people had a choice between losing their technology and not breathing, they'd probably go for not breathing. That it is their reality. The virtual reality is reality. It's not what's out there, the trees and so on. It's the iPad and the iPhone and the text. So anyway, that was the number one reason that they didn't tell anybody, because they figured, well, they're going to start taking me off Facebook or whatever. Definitions, lots of definitions. The one we came up with, and I won't go into details, it's in your materials, but is one that's quite similar to the Ontario one. But first of all, recognizing that cyberbullying is a form of bullying. It's not a totally separate thing, but it's a form of bullying done through various forms of technology. The most frequent message now is, of the most frequent source is either Facebook or texting. I mean, things move so quickly, it's not even email. Email's passé, as you all know, right? Email's so passé, right? We're all into texting and Facebook and so on. So it moves with the technology. One of the things, a couple of things that slightly vary from the Ontario definition, and we used Eric's input and the Ontario as a starting point for this, is that first of all, that it doesn't directly allude to the kinds of groups in the Human Rights Code, although they're very much implicated, and the Ontario one says it's not just that, but they do refer to that, and that was an interesting debate. And secondly, and as far as I know, this is the only one in Canada, and this hasn't quite been adopted yet, but I'm assured will be adopted shortly. We'll come to whether or not the government has responded as quickly as I'd like. But the one thing that I think is fairly unique, we include that at the very last line, a person participates in bullying if he or she directly carries out the behavior or assists in or encourages his behavior in any way. So this definition actually adds bystanders, participating or encouraging bystanders. And that arises out of the fact that a lot of the studies we looked at, the bystander is a critical player in the issue of bullying. That one of the key variables is how do others react to the comment about liking it online. And so therefore, we didn't go to the beyond the Good Samaritan. You're not positively obligated to intervene, but if you encourage or if you participate, for example, YouTube videos of people fighting or being bullied online, or cheering while in extreme cases when young women are raped and these kind of things, that's an offense. And so we include bystanders, and I throw that out just as something for Eric and the powers that be in Toronto and Ontario to think about, that what is the position of bystanders, or at least encouraging. We don't say all bystanders. Also, I might just, now that I switched to the other and got your interest on sexting, I'll try to bring you back for a moment. That definition is actually cited by the recent Supreme Court of Canada decision in AB versus Bragg, which I'll come to later. Not that they said this is the best, but they did use that one. One form of texting, of cyberbullying, is sexting, which most of you know involves sending either pictures or even comments that are sexually suggestive or messages that have a sexual tone to it. And that's a very frequent thing. I'm sure many of you have experienced it in your schools. A Canadian study by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, 19% of all teen respondents, 13 to 19, and 22% of teenage girls participated in texting. Now, there was a recent article since the task force in the Globe said, so that's basically 1 in 5. So if you think about that for a moment, 1 in 5 young women are sending nude or semi-nude pictures, which in itself is astounding. But more recent studies suggest that that number actually may be 1 in 3, that this is significantly underreported. Frequently, the kind of power imbalance that comes with cyberbullying, and Amanda Todd is the perfect example, where people are intimidated or forced or pushed into doing it, even though they don't naturally want to do it, by a boyfriend, by whoever. And of course, the naivete of youth, of course, the boyfriend swears it'll never go to anybody else. And then, being the cad that many males are, he immediately sends it to his friends, or failing that, certainly when they break up, it's sent to everybody in sight and so on. So anyway, that's one. And on the bottom, the Pew Research one, 15% of 12 to 70-year-olds who own cell phones say they've received it. Now, they're not the exact same study, but it does make me wonder what happened to the other 5%. You know, where did they go? 20% were sent, 15% were received. Somebody out there is collecting the other 5%, I guess. I don't think it's Eric. Okay, another very useful insight from the Youth Task Force, people become brave on Facebook. They become keyboard warriors. And that's really, like so many of these great insights from young people, and this is a grade 11 student, but it really makes the point that one of the reasons that cyberbullying and the internet is so much stronger, you're frequently anonymous, there's no accountability in any way, shape, or form. So people that wouldn't go to your face and do something will certainly do it online. And that came out of the talk show when I appeared on that yesterday as well. Links and myths, bullying and teen suicide. So in Canada, suicide accounts for 2% of all, or 24% of all deaths among 15 to 24-year-olds. That's startling in itself, right? And then it goes on to say suicide is the second leading cause of death for Canadians between the ages of 10 and 24. So for those of us who think the Jenna story or the Amanda Todd story are these kind of odd exceptions, that's not what the statistics say. Suicide rates are 5 to 7 times higher among Aboriginal youth, so that's even more so. And Dr. Stan Kuchar, who presented to the task force, said bullying and cyberbullying do not directly cause suicide. However, youth suicide can be impulsive. Therefore, bullying or cyberbullying can be a contributing factor when other circumstances already exist. So the suicide is not an everyday response, thank goodness, but it is a significant one, and those stats are pretty staggering. It has a clear effect, as indicated in the youth survey, on the LBGT youth. Recent CBC reports noted that suicide rates are 16 times higher among LBGT youth. So again, not accidental that the Ontario definition links to the categories in the human rights codes, because they are not exclusively the victims, but they're large among them. And the Stonewall School Report 2012 looked at the experience of 1,600 gay secondary school pupils. Shockingly, more than half of lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people still report experiencing homophobic bullying at schools. It's still an issue. Over 2 in 5 gay pupils who experience this bullying attempt or think about taking their own life as a direct consequence. So 2 in 5, so even higher. Equality and diversity, again, going back to that theme, links to it, technology. I mean, ironically, technology was supposed to be one of these, and is, in all kinds of ways, a wonderful positive thing. Here I'm using it as I speak. But one of the things it was supposed to do was to produce a certain amount of equality, and in some ways it did that. If you think about the Arab Spring and people using cell phones and texting and blogs and so on. But in the other ways, it actually creates an even bigger divide. And one of them, first of all, access to technology, because if you don't have the money, you don't have access to technology throughout the world. And secondly, in this study that they talked about, the lower income or single-parent families and others tend to have less supervision, although parent supervision of online activity is a problem across the board. But if anything, it's kind of divides along economic lines and others as well. So that's something to look at as well. Partnership, given the links between human rights and issues of bullying, one of the recommendations that we made was to have a protocol and link to the human rights commissions, and this is something that hasn't got a lot of attention. Crimes of cyberbullying, civil suits for defamation, these kind of things we'll touch upon. But one of the things, and this has been particularly usefully explored in places like Australia, is that since many, although not all, victims of cyberbullying are also members of vulnerable groups, that you can send some of those, and schools like sending problems elsewhere, I would think, right? Send some of those to human rights commissions. You know, so much of cyberbullying, some of the Amanda Todd cyberbullying was clearly gender-based, right? It was based on her being a woman. The major victim group are gays and lesbians and so on. So a lot of that can be dealt with in human rights commissions, and one of the number of advantages, less expensive, generally quicker access, and a variety of different responses, mediation, restorative approaches, only as a last resort, adversarial tribunals. So Australia has used that with some success, and I think that's a useful strategy to be explored. Marginalized groups are significant, as I've already indicated, so we recommended that the government look at whether the existing Education Act adequately protects the particularly marginalized groups such as gays, lesbians, African Nova Scotians, and so on. Another insightful comment from the kids: other people's feelings should be more important than your own. If everybody thought that way, there wouldn't be any bullying. This is a grade 4-5 split class student. A good point, right? I mean, that's part of that larger social problem. Bullying is really a symptom of other problems, which you're the center of the universe and other people's feelings don't count. So in that context, bullying thrives. But if more people thought like this for a grade 4 or 5, we might have a lot less problems. Safe and inclusive schools, social and emotional learning, empathy and respect. One of the major recommendations, and this has been acted on, is Nova Scotia now has an anti-bullying coordinator, and one of the important tasks that we assigned to that person, or recommended that that person do, is select evidence-based effective prevention programs that would assist with preventing bullying and cyberbullying. Obviously much better to prevent than act after the fact. And most schools said, we don't know what to do with all the stuff that's coming at us. There's hundreds of programs out there, so what do we do? So one of the challenges is this person is to go through with whatever expertise they need, select based on these criteria: cost, appropriate to the Nova Scotia context, evidence-based, so on. And a lot of them, as the title suggests, emotional and learning and empathy. Because a lot of the problem with bullying and cyberbullying is a lack of empathy for other human beings. I mean, one of the depressing realities of all of this on the Amanda Todd website, even after she committed suicide, if you have the courage to go look at that, there's still every day people saying terrible, hurtful things, like she deserved to die, the world's better without her. This is after she's died. So that's not exactly good demonstrations of empathy. So as schools, are we really producing empathy and respect for human life? Seems not. Inclusion and anti-bullying, who should be responding? Well, I think Eric put it well when he presented to us. It's a big problem. You have to do everything. I don't know if that was original with him, but it's a good point. And in some ways, that's true. And there's so many different people that need to be involved. Parents have a role, teachers, school administrators, counselors, the justice system, community at large, social media networks, internet server, the list is there. But you can see there's a lot to be done. And sometimes I think people feel, and the schools feel, I'm putting it all in your ballpark. I'm not doing that, although I think schools are a significant area that can make a difference. But certainly parents, the private sector, and on one very positive note, a lot of private sector, Rotary clubs and others were quite anxious to try to help. And even places like Facebook and ones like that, for good and PR reasons, both, want to help out and are often willing to pay money because they're the offenders in some or Facebook, so they're happy to have some good PR about supporting these things. So there's a lot of players involved. Community, it's a community issue. It's not just schools, it's not just parents, it's all of these. It's a broad-based community issue, and we need to have a broad community response. Partnering with internet service providers and police, and a lot of you, based on my earlier session this morning, already have that, but you need to have good relationships with the police, and they and the schools need to be able to deal with internet service providers, because a lot of time the critical information as to if it's cyberbullying, where is this coming from and who's doing it, you're only going to get access to that through the internet service providers, and there's big legal issues of privacy and so on, but that's important. So we have a couple of recommendations on that as well, and including, I don't know if it's in this group, exploring, although I'm not necessarily an advocate of this, of adding cyberbullying to the criminal code. We may not need to do that if we apply the existing provisions, but maybe we do. We should at least look at that. Role of parents. For those of you who are parents, this looks familiar, right? The role of parents is one that's hard to deal with, and actually, oddly enough, perhaps the law doesn't actually put a lot of obligations on parents, but I'm sure you have the same in Ontario. In our Education Act, there is a section on parent duties, and we suggested that there should be a duty, no particular penalty attached, requiring parents to supervise the online conduct of their children, at least to the extent where it may detrimentally affect the school situation. And consistent with that, in other recommendations, recognizing that they often don't have the skills about social media or technology, that education be provided to parents so they can learn more about technology and social media and what to look for. I mean, you'll always be behind the young people, but maybe a little bit less. But anyway, we propose that duty. Most of these haven't been enacted, but I'll come to that. What roles do schools play? So a safe and inclusive school climate includes one, obviously, in which there's not bullying and cyberbullying. And from the Supreme Court Canada on down, and your own policies, clearly part of what schools want to do is produce a safe and inclusive school environment. And anti-bullying and anti-cyberbullying is clearly part of that. Expanded school jurisdiction. Now, on this one, you're ahead of us because you already have this, and we discussed this in our little search workshop as well. We recommend that they should make clear by adding to the Education Act that not only do you have jurisdiction on school premises and during school hours, but also off premises and after hours if the nexus to the school is that the conduct detrimentally affects the school climate. And I think that's already the state of the law. It's the state of law of Ontario for sure, because in your Education Act, they're not willing to do this in Nova Scotia yet, but I think that's the state of the law whether they do it or not. And that's obviously vital in respect to issues of cyberbullying because most of it doesn't happen on school grounds or on school computers. It's people at home sending messages and cyberbullying other students from the bedroom in the middle of the night. And I don't think principals should be kind of creeping around and looking in bedrooms in the middle of the night, but if it is brought back to the school, then you have jurisdiction. Staff reporting duties, also presently in the Ontario Act, and actually in the first reading just a couple of days before I left, that's now being added in Nova Scotia as well, that not just teachers but all staff have an obligation to report it. And of course, in order to report it, you have to know what it is. So there is also a policy, I'd prefer it was in statute, but there's going to be a policy definition adopting the staff or the task force definition so that everybody will know what it is they're supposed to report, and training sessions. You know, for example, if you say to bus drivers, as an example, you got to report bullying and cyberbullying. Well, that's fine. So what is it? You know, what counts as bullying? What counts as cyberbullying? So that's in process. Role of teachers, their role models, support of listeners, proactive, duty to report, skills and resources. Teachers, next to parents, probably the most critical players. Educating staff, and I don't know what the situation is in Ontario, but in Nova Scotia at least, the curriculum for teacher training in the various universities does not adequately address issues, not just issues of bullying and cyberbullying, but social and emotional learning, inclusive education, restorative approaches. There's a number of things that we think should be part of the teacher education curriculum, and further, the post-employment education, that there need to be in-services dedicated to these same kind of things, because people need a lot more information, a lot more understanding of the strategies. Role of the justice system, and somebody can make sure I'm not getting too far here, is both in inclusive schooling and safe schools. And I'll just go through this very quickly because that could be a whole other presentation. Of course, inclusive schools, as I said earlier, to me is part of a good response, and that happens through the language of the Education Act, the Human Rights Codes, the Charter, and those, a series of cases, which I won't go into now, except that there are a series of cases from the Laforet, Malcolm Ross case, the Eaton, Weinberg, more currently before the Supreme Court of Canada, and will be a very interesting one in defining the fact that in order to meet the requirements of the Charter and Human Rights Codes, they have to be inclusive. And this is the quote from the Ross case, and a lot of people, I'm sure, in your system with good legal advice, you get this, but the Ross case is really quite an amazing decision, which states from the Supreme Court of Canada that there's a positive obligation on school boards to create safe and inclusive school environments, that race, gender, all these other things should not be a restriction on the education system. But it's fairly significant, and certainly not so clear in the United States, that you have the Supreme Court of the country saying you have a positive obligation to do that. And again, to my mind, putting effective programs in for bullying and cyberbullying is part of that. Certainly not a safe and inclusive climate if you're a gay student who's being constantly bullied and harassed and so on. The Lighthouse of Equality, that's a whole other topic for another day, but obviously the Charter and Human Rights Codes talks about not just ending individual discrimination, but systemic, and there's the articles there, so you can read that at your leisure or again when you have trouble sleeping. Reasonable accommodation and limits. All of these rights, of course, are not absolute. There's obviously cost implications and so on, so they're not absolute, so there is reasonable accommodation, but the starting point is inclusion, and that's quite important. Things like cost, health, size, and so on, the things you're familiar with. So, safe schools, how do we go about that from a justice system point of view? Criminal code, lawsuits, negligence, defamation, constitutional limits, human rights, restorative approaches. I'm starting to speed up, as you can tell here, but it's all there. Criminal codes, as I've already mentioned, there are a number of provisions, and in fact recently in London, Ontario, the criminal harassment provisions were used to charge, I think, 8 young women, and one other provision used somewhere else. So there are provisions there that can be used, and one advantage of the high profile and high consciousness around these issues now that quite a bit more is happening. And police have been reluctant in the past to extend the existing provisions to the cyberbullying situation. So to the extent that it questions whether you need to have an offense of cyberbullying, and maybe you do, or maybe the existing ones are enough. And you can see just some of the examples there. There was also the Dawn Marie Wesley case, I think, was that from BC or Ontario? I can't be BC, I think, where they did apply an actual case, applied criminal harassment as well. So there are some. Youth Criminal Justice Act, as you know, or know to some extent, has a special status for those between 12 and 17, and certain rights apply there, but they can still be charged. Under 12, they can't be with criminal offenses, and so that's something that obviously needs to be looked at as well. Whether you need a crime of cyberbullying, question mark. Many people sort of jump on that as the obvious thing. It might be a good idea, and in the editorial that Eric referred to in the introduction, I think I was quoted, and the editorial person himself was saying that with our criminal code we make a statement about what's most important in our society. So as a kind of moral statement, it is important perhaps to say this is not just a minor thing. And in fact, in another article that I've written with others, we made the point that the language, this is something for the linguists or English teachers among you to think about, our language of bullying itself is kind of problematic, right? Bullying sounds kind of minor. It's a rite of passage. You're bullying, you're jostled a bit. You know, it's not an assault, it's not an harassment, it's not an intimidation, all things which are criminal and legal things. It's bullying. You know, everybody bullies. We all were bullied. And we had somebody call into the show, the Ontario Today, or what it was, show yesterday, saying, I don't know what all the fuss about. Bullying is just a natural part of life. You just got to get tough and get used to it. And I don't fully agree with that, although it's always been there. But I think cyberbullying in particular is too serious for that. So it would serve that purpose. We don't have to have it if there's others. And the criminal code, as with most things, should only be used in the extreme cases. But, you know, take the Amanda Todd case as an example. You know, from what we know, the fact that, and not necessarily a young person, in fact, I think the early evidence was 30 or 40-year-old, right, that was intimidating or threatening her if she didn't send nude pictures. That seems to me like criminal conduct myself. Negligence is another area, and this is an interesting whole area to be explored, newer territory. But it seems to me, given that we can all foresee and predict that bullying and cyberbullying will happen in schools, if you don't take reasonable steps, you can't guarantee it won't happen, but if you don't take reasonable steps to do something to prevent it or to provide supports, you may well be liable to a negligence lawsuit and the various dollar figures that go with that. And that's becoming a much more frequent thing. Defamation, if the statements are untrue, the Supreme Court case I'll get to in a moment is one of those, is another one. Not easy, and one of the problems with defamation cases is you have to play out the kind of damaging comments again, but that's another way the legal system can pursue it. And as the consciousness raises and people see this as a more serious problem, I think there's more likelihood that these legal consequences will be pursued. And one example of that, the AB versus Bragg Communications case out of Nova Scotia, the young woman who, in fact, another situation that was presented as in the talk show yesterday, somebody sets up a fake Facebook account with her picture and her making terrible, negative, racist, sexist comments about others, not her at all. And she wants to sue them for defamation because clearly it was attacking her character. It wasn't her. She only found out from a friend that it was there. And I had a couple of people call in yesterday saying the same kind of thing. This is not uncommon. And so the young woman wanted to pursue a defamation claim, and through her parents, she wanted to get the identity through the internet service provider, because you have to know who you're suing. And secondly, she wanted to do it anonymously as AB, so that she wouldn't have to be re-victimized. And this kind of sounds like sexual assault cases, right, where going to trial and reliving all the circumstances in the first place is a kind of re-victimizing of the event. And at both levels in the Nova Scotia courts, trial and appeal, they said, we'll give you access to the internet service provider and require them to do it, but you have to reveal your name and you have to give all the circumstances. Both levels of court said that, because the open court principle requires proof of harm. You haven't proved harm. Supreme Court of Canada, citing my report as a redeeming for those in my search case where they cited my article to completely disagree with it. Here they actually cited to agree with it, so that's always better. They cited the report saying you don't really need to prove harm in cyberbullying. Of course, cyberbullying is hurtful. And of course, if people are going to put these comments on Facebook, why should she have to prove specific harm? It's obvious. We can kind of take judicial notice of the fact that there's harm. And therefore, it is a sufficient and important enough exception to protect young people that the normal open court principle has an added exception. It's already an exception in case of sexual assault. It's now an exception for young people pursuing cyberbullying, that they can pursue it without giving their names. They didn't give the ban on the information, which makes sense enough to me. If it's not linked to you personally, then there's not a damage. The information will be out there, but her name will not be identified. So that's quite an important case, a very significant victory. Kids Help Phone and a number of other people intervene, and it's seen as a really important victory for victims of bullying and cyberbullying. And as you can see, 2012, just a couple of months ago, or maybe not even that. There are constitutional limits to all of this. Some of this is federal, some of it's provincial, regulation of telecommunications, internet service providers, the criminal stuff, and of course lots of charter questions, privacy, free speech, and just one dramatic case from the US, the Brown versus Entertainment Merchants, which was a case involving very violent video games available to young people, and a state law passed preventing the selling of these really violent video games to the general public, and you can read this in the materials. But the majority, in perhaps classic broad free speech approach in the United States, struck down the law. They said no, the free speech is broad enough that you can sell these super violent, super sexualized video games to young people. In dissent, Justice Breyer made a very good point. He's saying that if you've got a young woman who's gagged, tortured, and ultimately killed, there's nothing you can do about it unless she's topless. And if she's topless, then that's an offense and is not protected by free speech. But if it's just plain violence, that's okay. Which does seem to be a bit bizarre and wrong. I mean, it seems to me, without going out too much on a limb here, if we were half as concerned about violence as we were about sex, we might be better off as a society, but that's for another day. All right, human rights issues, and human rights commissions have an important role to play, as I indicated earlier, and Australia is one example where that's a vehicle short of civil suit, short of criminal action, much less expensive, more accessible way of dealing with these in a different process. And they can educate, mediate, restorative approaches, so on. One example from the BC Court of Appeal, the Gibran case, is a very interesting one if people haven't looked at this under the Human Rights Code, where the schools were found liable because they did not adequately protect this young boy who had been pursued and harassed and bullied and cyberbullied about sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation. He said he wasn't gay, but it doesn't really matter. He was perceived to be gay over many years. And one of the things that makes this a particularly powerful case for doing something before you're brought to court is they did a lot of the traditional things. They didn't ignore it. They expelled students, they had them come to their office, but what they didn't do, the BC Court of Appeal said, you didn't put in place adequate prevention measures. You didn't do enough because it continued year after year. So it's not enough to just do things. You've got to do effective things. So that's just one, just does not suggest this is all sort of pie in the sky, that litigation is quite realistic. Restorative approaches. One of the positive aspects or positive elements of our process were some of the creative responses that were happening. And Nova Scotia, within the education system and elsewhere, is a bit of a leader on restorative approaches. And we had very impressive young people come to us and talk about peer restorative approaches, which has various components that are set out there. But one form is going back to the kind of Aboriginal talking circles, and that the offenders, the victims, the general community discuss the problem and try to find ways to have them acknowledge what they're doing and make amends. And they had great success stories, and where restorative approaches have been adopted in a lot of schools, the expulsion rates have dropped, the violence has dropped, quite a good success rate. Not, again, there's no simple silver bullet, but it's one thing worth looking at. And I think one of the key reasons that that's relatively successful is that it's peer-based. You know, they have to answer to their own peers, and it's part of making people recognize bullying and cyberbullying is not cool. In fact, it's beyond not cool, it's terrible. And therefore, simple things like the pink shirt thing that was also started in Nova Scotia as a way of sending messages of not siding against the victims, but with the victims, starts to send that message. This is not acceptable conduct, and it's not acceptable among your peers, the people that count. I mean, by and large, I'm overstating, but by and large, young people don't care too much what old people like us think. That's because we're out of touch and we don't know anyway. But if their peers don't think it's good, they'll pay attention to that. So I think there's some real possibilities there. Education legislation, Ontario, Nova Scotia, not so much, but Quebec and New Brunswick are kind of the leaders on this. Ontario in particular has a lot of good legislation in this, and many of our recommendations which haven't yet been enacted in Nova Scotia are based on that. Quebec as well has some legislation, in New Brunswick as well. In fact, New Brunswick legislation, ironically, adopts more recommendations on legislation from my report than the Nova Scotia one does, but they didn't even have to pay for it. Not that they paid very much anyway, but anyway, okay. The one thing they did do in Nova Scotia, which is not a big thing, but the preamble now recognizes as part of what schools are about the inclusion, the whole school approach, and creating a safe environment without bullying and cyberbullying and those kind of things. A quick review, which you can just look at. It's interesting, though, other than Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and not that legislation is the total answer, most of the other provinces have not enacted legislation. BC has not. They put $2 million into prevention programs, and that's not a bad thing. I talk in the report about kind of a trilogy of responses in terms of prevention, education, and law, and of those, prevention is probably the most important, education perhaps next, and law in some ways third, although I make the case, and I think it's true, symbolically having this stuff in law is really significant. And I cite in the report things like drunk driving or domestic violence or seatbelts, that it needs to be attacked at several levels, but you send an important message in law. And if you think about something like drunk driving, which is now taken very seriously in the law, most of us are old enough that we lived through a time where that was not so much the case. And social views about it, all of that very different. And the law is sending a message and kind of anchoring the change. So I think you need the law as well, myself. So that's the situation. But other than those four, there's not a lot of specific legislation on this, and Nova Scotia hasn't done very much. Accountability, at the end of the day, you know, you have to be, somebody has to be accountable for progress, is whether it's the school system, whether it's the schools, what advances are really being made. And, I think that's really an unescapable point. So in concluding thoughts, so I am getting close to it anyway, inclusion benefits all, invest up front, pay now or pay later. So financial support, human supports, proper inclusive schooling, best antidote to bullying. So again, linking the concept of inclusion in whole school with that of bullying. Thus, conclusion here, thus safe and inclusive schools are expensive, but not nearly as expensive as failing to invest in the quality education of our children and so on. You're familiar with those things. And finally, my last slide, picking on my education minister, Ramona Janex, who's the one bullying me, not such a bad likeness, when the report came out because they were a little resistant. They weren't happy with the fact that there were 85 recommendations. And to be fair, they've done some good things and they're making some progress, so I don't want to be unfair, but I'd like a lot more. Thank you very much.
So, as Professor MacKay said, yesterday he spent an hour on Ontario Morning on CBC. You have him here. We have some time, so please feel free to ask questions, and he'll repeat the questions so everyone can hear them.
I've got one question. It's really, you spoke a bit about our language, and my experience is that the term cyberbullying doesn't resonate with our young people. It works well for us, but as you say, it has even downsides for adults. I'm wondering if in your interviews with young people, they use different terminology that spoke better to their experiences or that resonated better with them than cyberbullying.
No, that's a really good point, because language is important and there is quite a gap in terms of young and old. I'm not exactly sure what the term would be, but it's a perfectly good point. And I go back to the wisdom and desirability of consulting young people, not just about the problem, but what might we do about it and what would they use. Now, sometimes that can have a downside as well, in that a number of studies say that a lot of young people understate what's cyberbullying. So it's like sexual harassment, right? If you go into schools and ask young women, have you been sexually harassed? All kinds of them would say, well, no, I haven't been sexually harassed. Okay, did anybody ever touch your breast? Oh yeah, that happens all the time, but that's not sexual harassment. That can be one kind of aspect, but having said that, there still are important ways to think about how else we could describe this. I agree.
Rory, would you do me a huge favor? Because we're on video. Could you step around and there's a mic back there? I'm sorry, Rory. Rory McGuckin is the supervisory officer in charge of safe schools for the Toronto Catholic Board. I'll just introduce you before you speak.
Thanks, Eric. Wayne, at the beginning you mentioned the real concerted effort to get a evidence-based bullying program into the schools in Nova Scotia, and like you, not a week goes by where there's not 5 or 6 different groups or organizations that are going to end the problem. Can you elaborate as to which 1 or 2 the government decided to try to utilize in a broad manner in Nova Scotia?
I can, and it wouldn't take very long. None at the moment. That's perhaps not entirely true. Nothing that they aren't currently doing. And they have now appointed the coordinator who is tasked with, among other things, using whatever experts they need in applying those criteria to select what are the best evidence-based effective programs. Given the shortness of time, I'm by no means expert on this, but a few programs that seem to be quite promising, restorative approaches with a lot of peer involvement seems to be quite successful. Various programs aimed at social and emotional learning are certainly useful. We recommend in the report digital courses for students on digital citizenship and for parents along similar kinds of lines. So there are some things out there, but it is difficult for the very reasons, and I get all kinds of enterprising people saying, here's, I've got the answer, to, you may want to look at this, and boards are getting that, and the school administrators in our working group said, we're happy to try to do something, but we don't know what to do when we're given a list of, here's 200 ideas, think about it. They want somebody to sit down and say, based on the best evidence that we have, here are the 3 or 4 best programs. I think it's important that there not be just one, because there's always a diversity of situations, in your case, Catholic schools, public schools, whatever, different settings or different parts of the province. So if you have a range of effective programs that they can pick from, and one other recommendation, which is a bit optimistic, I guess, is that by the 2013-2014 year, every school board would be applying at least one approved prevention program. And prevention not just of cyberbullying, or maybe a combination, but also suicide. A lot of recommendations, which I didn't get into because of the shortness of time, but we have a number of recommendations about education, about identifying suicide risks, suicide prevention, those kind of things as well.
Thank you.
No problem.
You spoke earlier about students' reality, and I'm just wondering if you have suggestions about how we bridge a gap that I perceive, at least from my generation, because it's not my reality. And yet, as administrators and teachers in schools, we're sort of dealing with their reality, and yet we have our own, and there's a disconnect. So how do we bridge that?
Well, that's a really good and important question. I don't have any simple answer except to say it's a really significant problem. Many of the young people in the youth focus groups were saying, in addition to taking away the computer, why would we consult adults? They have nothing useful to say. So it goes both ways. I think as adults, teachers, parents, and general people in the community, we probably need to be, we need to be more open-minded about social media. We need to not be in a state of denial to say, well, just shut it all off and throw away all the electronics. That's not going to work. So we have to at least be more educated and aware of that. But it goes both ways, too. I think there needs to be an awareness in young people that, some of the older ideas are not necessarily bad. That maybe it's not such a great idea to be crossing a busy crosswalk while you're texting or driving while you're texting, for example. Not that that's exclusive to young people, but it seems to me we need to work on that dialogue. And in a sense, schools are perhaps ideally placed. It's a huge challenge to try to do that. Educating parents is another part of that, because many times parents who mean well can't possibly supervise the online activity because they have no idea what it is. They don't know what Tumblr is, or all the other kinds of things that are out there, and various websites, or one that I ran into, thedirty.com. I don't know how many of you know about thedirty.com. If you want to be appalled, you can look it up. Thedirty.com used to be an American thing, but now a Canadian, where they select particular cities and people post pictures and completely negative, racist, sexist comments about people which are not in any way verified. And you only know, you might be on there now. If you went to thedirty.com in Toronto, there may be a picture of you and people making these comments. And that's the adult world. So I guess the other point, I'm kind of straying a bit here, but the other point is that even though my mandate was to look at cyberbullying with young people and youth, it's not as though adults don't bully and cyberbully. And in fact, some of the main role models for bullying behavior are adults, parents, teachers, principals, I'm sure, are immune because they would never do that. But I actually go out on a limb, it's not a terribly big limb in the report, to saying that some high-profile media or CBC models of bullying would be Kevin O'Leary or Don Cherry. Seemed to work for them.
One last point. Yep.
Do you know of any situations or cases where the providers of the social media, like Facebook, they have their responsibilities articulated for their users, have been involved and held liable? Or is the potential for that? I'm just trying to think of other ways to go at it.
Yeah, it's a really important question. There are a lot of rules which everybody just clicks, when you sort of, before you go to the next, and they have the big pages, continues, everybody clicks continue and don't read it and so on. They do have rules which, if you are aware of them and draw their attention, they will take things down, or if users are abusing the rules of Facebook or whatever. So there are some internal things that can be done. As far as lawsuits, there's very little in Canada or the US, and this, I'm not an expert in this area, maybe Eric even, I might well know more about this than I do, but I think they're seen as having less responsibility even than newspapers for what they print. I mean, they're basically a carrier, so if you draw it to their attention and you convince them that it's, well, certainly if it's criminal or extremely hurtful, they may take it down. Going back to my example, and this is not so good, this is in thedirty.com, they will take it down for a price, but they won't do it unless you pay their, which one of the ways they make money. So you can get it down if you pay their fee. But in any event, that's not normally the case with places like Facebook, but most people don't know. I wouldn't know necessarily, where do you go to make a complaint? And a lot of recommendations are to make that more available, that educate people about what you do. And this is not just for kids. What if some really negative defamatory site is out there? How do you respond through the internet service providers? So there's not a lot of law. I think the better way is to try to work out protocols between the police and the internet service providers in the schools. That's probably a better way to go.
Thank you.
And I guess just one final footnote to that, because money's always important. Now that Ontario is a have-not province, you can join us in Nova Scotia in being concerned about these things, and we have to depend on people like Newfoundland, right? So the situation with money very often is that Google and Facebook and places like this are quite happy to provide money for programs because it's good public relations for them. So, for example, we had a representative from Facebook who came up and gave completely free service for all kinds of things. So there is a financial resource out there, which might be very interesting to school boards, that could fund programs and things like that.
Thank you.
I'll just thank you. Okay. So, just want to thank Professor MacKay. First of all, his task force report is phenomenal. You can all get it free of charge. Just Google the Nova Scotia Task Force on Bullying and Cyberbullying. You can download it. It's very, very insightful. It's the most up-to-date publication on this in the subject in the country. In your materials, we have a BLG newsletter, and the writer of the newsletter talks about she's saying educators who are interested in creating a healthy, respectful environment for their students will find the task force report timely, thoughtful, and insightful. And I want to echo those comments today to Professor MacKay. Particularly one quick point, which is what permeated your comments today was the peer group recognition that Facebook and online communication is part of the oxygen they breathe. And you even sort of alluded to that on on the talking about restorative justice and saying, that peer group pressure is such a powerful point, and that permeated as a thread throughout your presentation. Absolutely fascinating. So on behalf of this group and on behalf of OISE UT, I want to thank you very much for your outstanding presentation.